The student was crying in class until the janitor sat beside her. She didn't hear the bell. Grace sat at the back of the classroom, hunched over her desk, arms wrapped tight around her backpack like it was the only thing keeping her together. The room filled with noise as students poured in, chatting, laughing, pushing into their seats. Someone opened a window. Another kid dropped his binder and the papers went everywhere. But Grace didn't move. She stared down at the scuffed linoleum floor, eyes blank. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. The chair next to Grace scraped loudly as a boy pulled it out and plopped down. He glanced at her for half a second before turning to the kid behind him and talking about some video game tournament. Grace didn't react. She just sat there, her fingers gripping her backpack strap so tight her knuckles turned pale. At the front of the classroom, Ms. Landry wrote theme and tone on the whiteboard with a green marker. Her neat handwriting curved slightly, like it always did. She turned around, ready to start the lesson, and her eyes swept across the room. They stopped when they reached Grace. For a moment, Ms. Landry hesitated. Her smile faltered, just slightly, but then she blinked, picked up her clipboard, and began taking attendance. Liam, here. Jasmine, here. Grace, silence. Ms. Landry looked up, already knowing she wouldn't get a response. Grace hadn't said here in 3 days. Ms. Landry checked the box next to Grace's name anyway, then moved on. Jasmine leaned over to the girl next to her and whispered something behind her hand. They both giggled. Grace shifted in her seat, just barely. A few more students trickled in late. The late bell rang. Ms. Landry clapped her hands twice. All right, everyone, notebooks out. Let's talk about Chapter 5 of Mice and Men. Grace didn't open her notebook. Ms. Landry talked about loneliness. She asked the class what they thought about Candy's dog. Was it a metaphor? Did Steinbeck use it to show something deeper? Nobody mentioned the girl in the back of the room who hadn't said a word all week. Nobody noticed her shoulders trembling beneath her hoodie. Except one person. Outside the classroom door, a mop bucket squeaked across the floor. Mr. Jenkins, the janitor, walked slowly past. He was old, maybe late 60s, with silver hair pulled back into a small ponytail and a navy blue shirt with Jenkins stitched on the chest. He stopped for just a second, peering into the room. His eyes landed on Grace. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his hand resting on the mop handle. Then he nodded to himself and continued down the hallway. Back inside, the discussion moved on. Kids raised their hands. The same few students always had answers. One of them said loneliness was a choice. Another said it was weakness. Grace lowered her head even more. She wasn't taking notes. She wasn't pretending to take notes. Her pencil sat untouched on her desk. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. The period dragged. The words on the board stayed the same. The second hand on the clock above the whiteboard ticked in a rhythm she could hear but couldn't feel. When the dismissal bell finally rang, chairs scraped back. Zippers zipped. Backpacks swung onto shoulders. Everyone left. Grace didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, arms wrapped tight around her backpack, eyes staring at the same spot on the floor. The classroom emptied quickly. Ms. Landry answered a question for a student, then packed up her materials and stepped out, saying, "Be sure to finish the chapter tonight." Grace didn't look up. The hallway noise grew louder, then faded. Now the room was almost silent. Almost. From the hallway, that mop bucket squeaked again. And this time, it stopped right outside the classroom door. The door was still open. Grace hadn't moved. Her arms stayed locked around her backpack, her cheek resting against the zipper. Her eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything. Outside, the mop bucket squeaked once, then stopped completely. The classroom felt bigger now. Empty chairs, quiet air, a paper rustled on the floor, the only sound inside. Then footsteps, slow, steady, careful. Mr. Jenkins stepped inside, his boots soft against the tile. He glanced around, like he was making sure no one else was there, then looked directly at Grace. She didn't flinch. He didn't say anything. Not right away. He just looked at her, the way someone looks when they're not trying to fix anything. They just want to understand. He took a step forward. Another. Then, without a word, he pulled out the chair at the desk beside hers. It creaked as he sat down. Grace turned her face slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. He didn't look at her. He looked out the window. The silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It was patient. Finally, he spoke. "Bad day?" His voice was deep and calm, not soft, but quiet. Grace blinked, then nodded. "That's okay," Mr. Jenkins said. "Bad days happen." He didn't follow it with advice. He didn't say it would get better. He just let it sit there, like that truth was enough on its own. Grace wiped at her cheek with her sleeve. "You don't gotta talk," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'll do the talking. I don't mind." She didn't answer, but her shoulders lowered just a little. Mr. Jenkins leaned back in the chair. "You know, I used to sit just about where you're sitting. Long time ago, though. Wasn't this school, but the desk looked the same. Same color. Same scratches on the top." Grace looked down at her desk. "There was this kid named Tony who sat behind me. He used to tap his pencil like it was a drum. Drove me crazy." Mr. Jenkins chuckled to himself. "Anyway, one day I came in, and I guess I looked pretty rough. Didn't sleep the night before. Mom and Dad were fighting. Loud." He paused. "It was one of those mornings where you just kind of show up, you know? You're there, but you're not really there." Grace didn't say anything, but she was listening. "I thought maybe someone would notice. Maybe the teacher. Maybe a friend. But nope. Bell rang, lesson started, and I just sat there. Quiet." He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. "Then the janitor came in. Not for me. Just cleaning up after someone knocked over a plant. Dirt everywhere. But as he was leaving, he stopped by my desk. Said I looked tired. That's all. You look tired today, son." Mr. Jenkins smiled faintly. "Don't know why that stuck with me. But it did. Felt like someone saw me for a second. Didn't fix anything. Didn't change my life. But it helped. Just a little." Grace slowly turned her head. Her eyes met his for the first time. "You looked like I did that day," he said. "That's why I stopped." She didn't cry. Not this time. She just looked at him. Really looked. And something in her expression softened. Mr. Jenkins stood up. He didn't say goodbye. He just gave her a small nod and walked to the door. Then he paused. "If you're still here tomorrow," he said, without turning around, "I'll be around." And then he left. The mop bucket squeaked again, fading down the hallway. Grace stayed in her seat a little longer, but this time she wasn't gripping her backpack. She was just sitting, breathing. The next morning, Grace walked into class early. Not too early, just a couple minutes before the bell, but early enough that the room was still mostly empty. Only 2 other students were there. One had headphones in, the other was scrolling on their phone. Grace picked the same seat in the back. She always did. The straps of her backpack slid off her shoulder as she sat down, and for once, She didn't pull it into her lap. She just let it fall beside her chair. Outside, the hallway buzzed, lockers slammed, laughter bounced off the walls. Jasmine walked in with another girl, Claire. They were talking loudly, their voices carrying over everything else. "Oh my gosh, did you see her yesterday?" Claire asked, smirking. "Seriously, just sitting there like a little lost puppy," Jasmine said. "Didn't even blink. Like, is she okay?" Claire laughed. "She's always like that. Quiet and weird. I bet she talks to her notebooks." They looked toward the back of the room. Grace didn't look up, but she knew they were staring. "Maybe she's just faking it," Jasmine added. "For attention." The words hit like pebbles. Not heavy, not loud, but sharp. Grace kept her eyes on the desk. She reached for her pencil and drew small circles on the corner of a page, one after another. Overlapping. Mindless. The bell rang. Students scrambled into their seats. Ms. Landry entered right after, carrying a stack of papers. "All right, everyone, let's settle in," she said, placing the papers on her desk. "We're diving deeper into character analysis today, so open your books to Chapter 6. Chairs creaked, pages turned. Someone dropped a pen. Grace opened her book slowly, even though she wasn't really reading yet. Ms. Landry started the lesson, writing a quote on the whiteboard and asking what it revealed about George's loyalty. A few hands went up. Jasmine's shot into the air. "It shows he's protective, but also kind of controlling." "Interesting point," Ms. Landry said. "Anyone else agree or disagree?" Claire nodded. "I think he acts more like a parent than a friend, like he doesn't really trust Lenny to think for himself." Laughter. Agreement. Grace didn't raise her hand. She didn't even look up. But she'd read the chapter. Twice. The quote reminded her of someone doing the right thing, even when no one noticed, even when no one would thank them for it. She thought of Mr. Jenkins. The sound of wheels squeaking broke her focus. Outside the door, just like yesterday, Mr. Jenkins passed by with his mop bucket. This time, he didn't walk straight past. He paused in the doorway. Ms. Landry turned toward him and smiled. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins." "Morning, Ms. Landry," he said. Then he looked toward the back of the room. Just a glance. Grace met his eyes. It lasted only a second. He nodded, barely noticeable. Then he kept walking. Jasmine leaned over to Claire again and whispered something behind her hand. Claire covered her mouth and snickered. Grace caught it. She felt the tightness return in her chest, the kind that made it hard to swallow, hard to stay in her seat. But this time, she didn't sink lower. She didn't shrink. She kept her back straight and stared at the words in her book. Ms. Landry wrote a new question on the board. "Why do you think George stays with Lenny even when it makes his life harder?" No one raised their hand. The room fell quiet. Grace glanced down at the notes she'd scribbled the night before. She knew the answer. She thought about loyalty, about sticking around when someone's having a hard time, about small, unnoticed moments that meant more than anyone realized. She looked at Ms. Landry. Then, quietly, she raised her hand. Ms. Landry looked surprised. Not in a bad way, more like she wasn't expecting it. Grace had barely spoken in class all year. Some students probably didn't even know what her voice sounded like. But now, her hand was up, slowly, carefully, like it might float back down if she changed her mind. Ms. Landry smiled gently. "Yes, Grace?" A few heads turned. Jasmine raised her eyebrows. Claire whispered something under her breath. Grace tried not to notice. She cleared her throat and spoke quietly, but her voice didn't shake. "I think George stays with Lenny because he knows Lenny wouldn't make it without him," she said. "But also, I think George stays because he needs someone to take care of. It makes him feel like he has a purpose." even if it's hard. The room was quiet for a second. Then Ms. Landry nodded. That's an excellent point. Thank you, Grace. Grace nodded once and looked back down at her desk, her cheeks warm. Claire gave Jasmine a look, like she didn't know how to react. Jasmine didn't say anything, just kept tapping her pencil against the side of her chair. Class moved on. The discussion picked up again, students building off Grace's answer. A few even nodded when Ms. Landry repeated her point. Grace didn't raise her hand again, but she listened closely. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like the desk was swallowing her. When the bell rang, students rushed out like usual. Jasmine and Claire lingered near the door. Jasmine glanced back at Grace as she left, but her face was unreadable. Ms. Landry was erasing the whiteboard. Grace, she said gently, can I speak to you for a moment? Grace stayed seated. Okay. Ms. Landry walked over and sat on the edge of a desk near hers. That was a thoughtful answer today. I'm really glad you shared. Thanks, Grace said, barely above a whisper. Ms. Landry paused. I know this week's been difficult. I just want you to know that if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Grace nodded. Okay. I mean that, Ms. Landry added. You don't have to go through hard stuff alone. Grace didn't answer, but she appreciated it. She really did. As she packed her things, she looked out the window. The courtyard was nearly empty, except for one figure across the way. Mr. Jenkins. He was on one knee, adjusting something near the flower bed. It looked like a snapped sprinkler head. He moved slowly, carefully, like everything he did had a purpose. Grace walked into the hallway, her backpack hanging loosely off one shoulder. She thought about what he had said yesterday. You looked like I did that day. She hadn't told anyone else what was going on, not even Ms. Landry. Not about the fights at home, not about her mom sleeping on the couch again, not about the way everything felt like it was just too much, too loud, too fast. But somehow, Mr. Jenkins had seen it. Grace paused by the water fountain. She didn't really need a drink. She just didn't want to go to her next class yet. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him coming down the hallway. Mr. Jenkins had a rag in one hand and a squeegee in the other. He didn't look surprised to see her. Hey there, he said. Grace gave a small wave. Hi. Nice answer in class today, he said. Caught part of it through the door. Her eyes widened a little. You heard that? Sure did. He wiped his hands on the rag. You've got a smart way of thinking. Grace looked down at her shoes. Thanks. Mr. Jenkins leaned on the mop handle. You keep talking like that, people are going to start listening. She smiled, just a little. Guess we'll see, she said. He smiled back. We will. Then he nodded, turned, and walked down the hallway. And this time, Grace didn't feel quite so invisible. The rain started right after lunch. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft tapping on the windows. Students rushed through the hallways, holding books over their heads like it would help. Jackets were zipped up. Sneakers squeaked across the tile floors. Grace sat in the cafeteria alone, picking at the edges of a peanut butter sandwich she hadn't touched. Her friends, if she could still call them that, had stopped sitting with her 2 weeks ago. No fight, no scene. Just quiet exits and cold shoulders. Now it was just her and a plastic tray. Across the room, Jasmine laughed loudly, flipping her hair and nudging Claire in the ribs. Grace didn't look their way. She already knew they were looking at her. Or talking about her. Probably both. She stared at the sandwich. One bite. Just one. But her stomach didn't want it. She reached into her pocket instead and pulled out the small, folded piece of paper she'd been carrying since that morning. It was nothing special, just a rough list of things she needed to do this week. a quiz on Thursday, a permission slip to turn in. At the bottom, she'd written one small note to herself in pencil. Just get through today. The cafeteria noise faded in and out. She wasn't really hearing it anymore. Then, "Mind if I sit here?" The voice was quiet. Grace looked up. Mr. Jenkins stood in front of her tray, holding a sandwich wrapped in foil and a small apple. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his mop bucket sat parked near the wall behind him. Grace blinked. Sure." He sat down carefully, the chair creaking under his weight. Neither of them said anything at first. He unwrapped his sandwich, took a bite, then glanced over at hers. "Peanut butter day," he said, chewing. "Always makes the cafeteria smell like a daycare center." Grace cracked a smile. "Kinda does." He smiled back. "You eatin' that, or just looking at it?" "I'm thinking about it." "Fair enough." The rain got louder against the windows. Mr. Jenkins took another bite, then pulled out a folded napkin from his shirt pocket. He wiped his hands. "You know," he said, "most people don't notice when someone's sitting alone." Grace didn't answer. "But I do," he said. "It's one of the few things I'm good at." She shrugged. "People just don't know what to say." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they think saying something will make it worse." Grace looked at him. "Do you?" He leaned back in the chair. "Nope. Don't think saying something ever made anyone's pain worse. Sometimes silence does, though." Grace picked up the corner of her sandwich, tore a tiny piece off. "My mom's been sleeping on the couch," she said quietly, "since last weekend." Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. "That's hard." "She won't talk about it. My dad leaves early, comes home late. Nobody says anything." Mr. Jenkins didn't interrupt. "I keep thinking maybe if I do everything right," she continued, "they'll stop pretending like I'm not there." She wasn't sure why she said it. The words just fell out. Mr. Jenkins folded his napkin in half. "You ever seen how they repair old houses?" he asked. Grace looked at him. "No." "Sometimes the damage isn't visible from the outside," he said. "Sometimes you gotta pull up the floorboards or open the walls, see what's rotting underneath." She blinked slowly. "You didn't cause the cracks, Grace, and it's not your job to fix them. But it's okay to say they're there." Her throat tightened. She looked down at the sandwich. "Thanks," she whispered. He stood up slowly, picked up his apple. "Still gotta mop up the gym," he said. "Basketball kids tracked in half the outside." Grace smiled faintly. "See you later?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "See you later." As he walked away, Grace finally took a bite. The gym floor was still damp. Mr. Jenkins pushed the wide mop in smooth, even strokes, making long lines across the glossy surface. The overhead lights reflected in the puddles, turning them into streaks of white. He'd been at it for over an hour. No one else was there. Practice had ended early because of the rain, and most students had gone home. The building was quiet now, except for the low squeak of the mop and the occasional rattle of thunder outside. Mr. Jenkins liked this time of day. It was when he could breathe. No bells, no chaos, just the sound of his work and the space to think. He leaned into the next stroke, then paused when he heard the gym door creak open. He looked up. Grace stood in the doorway, her hood up and her backpack slung over one shoulder. He straightened up slowly. "Hey there." "Hi," she said. "You're still here?" She nodded. "Didn't want to go home yet." He understood immediately. Grace stepped inside, letting the door close softly behind her. Her sneakers made soft squeaks as she crossed the gym floor, careful to avoid the areas still drying. "You ever play basketball?" Mr. Jenkins asked, nodding toward the far end of the court. "Not really," she said. I was always too short and bad at catching. He smiled. Catching's overrated. She dropped her backpack near the bleachers and sat on the bottom step. She watched him mop for a minute. You do this every day? Just about, he said. Sometimes twice if the weather's nasty. Grace looked at the wide, wet streaks of floor. It looks peaceful. It is, he said. Takes time. Can't rush it. She watched him work, the way he didn't seem bothered by how slow it was. There was something steady about it, like every motion had purpose. She wrapped her arms around her knees. Can I ask you something? Mr. Jenkins stopped mopping. Course. Why do you talk to me? He let the mop rest against the wall and walked over to the bleachers. He sat beside her, not too close, just enough to share the same space. Because you remind me of someone, he said. Who? Me, he answered. Back when I was your age, always sitting off to the side, quiet, carrying stuff around that no one saw. Grace looked down at her shoes. And maybe, he continued, because I wish someone had done it for me back then. She didn't say anything at first. Then, you think it would have helped? He nodded. Not fixed everything, but yeah, it would have helped. She let the silence settle between them. It's not like something bad just happened, she said quietly. It's like it's been happening for a long time, and some days I can pretend like it's not. But other days, it just gets heavy. I know that feeling, he said. Grace rubbed the sleeve of her hoodie between her fingers. At school, I can breathe a little more, but then people stare or whisper. Mr. Jenkins didn't ask who. He didn't need names. He already knew the type. You know what I figured out? He said. People who whisper usually do it because they're afraid to speak up, afraid they'll be seen. So they make sure someone else gets seen instead. Grace gave a small, sad laugh. That makes them sound kind of pathetic. They usually are, he said. Another beat of silence passed. Thunder rolled again outside. I don't hate home, Grace said, more to herself than to him. I just hate how I feel at home. Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. Maybe that'll change, he said. Maybe not. But no matter what, it doesn't get to define you. She turned her head to look at him. How do you know that? He looked back. Because you're here, still showing up, still trying. She sat with that for a moment, and for the first time in days, the weight in her chest felt just a little lighter. The next morning, Grace stood in front of her locker with one hand on the handle but didn't open it right away. She could hear Jasmine's voice echoing down the hallway, loud, carefree, and sharp in the way only someone confident enough to be mean could sound. Grace didn't need to look to know Claire was with her. The two were always together, like matching bracelets. Grace took a slow breath and opened the locker. Inside, everything was where she left it. Her math folder sat tilted against her English binder. A small photo of her and her mom from years ago was tucked in the corner, back when smiles came easier and the couch in the living room wasn't used as a bed. She grabbed her notebook and shut the door quietly. As she turned, Jasmine bumped into her shoulder, too hard to be an accident. Oh, sorry, Jasmine said, smiling. Didn't see you there. Claire smirked. Yeah, you're easy to miss. Grace looked at them, not with anger, just steady. You don't have to talk to me, she said, voice calm. But you also don't have to go out of your way to be cruel. The smirks faded just a little. Jasmine blinked. What? Grace didn't repeat herself. She just turned and walked down the hall. Claire mumbled something under her breath, but they didn't follow her. Grace's hands were shaking. Her face felt warm, but she kept walking. Inside her classroom, Ms. Landry greeted her with a soft, "Good morning." Grace gave a small smile. "Morning." She sat at her desk and opened her notebook. Her hands still trembled slightly, but she focused on her breathing, just like she'd started doing lately when things felt tight inside. Class filled up. Ms. Landry started writing on the whiteboard. Mr. Jenkins passed by the door again, mop handle in one hand, towel slung over his shoulder. He gave Grace the same quiet nod he always did. This time she smiled. During a break between periods, Grace walked to the library. It was quiet there, the light softer, fewer eyes. She sat at the back corner table and started reading a chapter from the next assigned book. She didn't have to. It wasn't due yet. But something about getting ahead gave her a tiny sense of control. 10 minutes later, a shadow moved beside her. She looked up. Mr. Jenkins stood there with a paper cup in his hand. "Hot chocolate," he said. "Cafeteria had some leftover. Figured you might want it." Grace's eyebrows lifted. "Really?" He shrugged. "Figured wrong?" "No," she said, reaching for it. "You figured right." He sat across from her, folding his hands in front of him. "Handled yourself pretty well this morning," he said. Grace blinked. "You saw that?" "Didn't have to hear everything, just enough." She looked into the cup. Steam curled softly from the surface. "I didn't know I was going to say anything," she admitted. "It just came out." "Those are usually the truest words," he said. She took a small sip. The chocolate was a little watery, a little too sweet, but it was warm, and it helped. "I thought it would feel better," she said, "standing up like that, but mostly, I just feel shaky." "That's how you know it mattered," Mr. Jenkins said. "The words that matter always leave a mark, on you or someone else." Grace thought about that. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she said softly. "You're not," he said. "You never were. Some people just need time to see what's right in front of them." She smiled again, this time without effort. Mr. Jenkins stood up and tipped an invisible hat. "See you around, Miss Grace?" "Yeah," she said. "See you around." As he walked away, she finished the hot chocolate and returned to her book. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around her didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. The next few days passed quietly, but something had shifted. Grace noticed it in the little things. Ms. Landry asked her opinion more in class, not forcing her, just opening the door. A few students even started nodding when she spoke. Not in a fake way either, like they were actually listening. She still sat alone at lunch, but it didn't bother her as much now. The quiet didn't feel like a punishment. And every day, without fail, Mr. Jenkins passed by her classroom, nodded, and kept going. But today was different. It was Friday. Grace walked into school under a gray sky, her hoodie pulled over her head. She made it to her locker without any run-ins, but she could feel a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't explain. There hadn't been another fight at home, no cruel whispers in the hallway. Everything was fine. But not really. She felt it anyway, the way anxiety sometimes does, for no reason at all. In first period, she couldn't focus. In second, she barely wrote anything down. By third, she was struggling to breathe without feeling like something was pressing on her chest. She didn't cry, not yet. But by the time lunch came, she didn't go to the cafeteria. She walked to the janitor's closet. She wasn't sure why. She just went. The hallway was empty. She stood outside the closed door and hesitated. Then she knocked. It took a moment, but the door opened slowly. Mr. Jenkins stood there, a bucket in one hand and a small radio clipped to his belt playing faint jazz. "Well," he said, surprised but not startled. "Didn't expect you here." Grace didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him. Her eyes said what her mouth couldn't. He stepped back without a word and held the door open. "Come on in." The room was small, filled with the smell of cleaning supplies and old wood. There was a stool in the corner, and Grace sat down without being asked. Mr. Jenkins closed the door behind her and leaned against a shelf. He didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, he pulled a battered shoebox off a shelf, opened it, and took something out. "I want to show you something," he said. He handed her a worn-out photo. It showed a young man, maybe 17, with messy hair, sitting on a curb outside a gas station. His clothes were stained, his eyes tired. "That's me," Mr. Jenkins said. Grace looked at the picture, then at him. "You look different." "Wasn't doing great when that was taken," he said. "Dropped out of school, lost my first job, didn't talk to my family much. Felt like everything I touched just fell apart." She studied the photo again. "What happened?" she asked. He chuckled. "A man who worked nights at that gas station gave me a spare sandwich one day, asked if I wanted to mop floors for cash. That was the start of everything turning." Grace blinked. "Because of a sandwich?" "Not the sandwich," he said. "The fact that someone saw me, like really saw me, made me feel like maybe I wasn't meant to disappear." He returned the photo to the box. "I carry that picture to remind myself that people don't stay in the same place forever. Not if they don't want to." Grace sat in silence, her eyes wet now but not falling. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be yet," she said. "You don't need to," Mr. Jenkins replied. "You just need to know you're allowed to become someone, one day at a time." She nodded. "Thanks for letting me in here." He smiled. "Thanks for knocking." Grace stood up, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and took a deep breath. Outside, the clouds were starting to break. And for the first time that day, the pressure in her chest finally loosened. It was the last class of the day. Grace sat near the window, watching the light shift across the floor. The clouds had finally cleared, and soft sunlight poured through the glass, warming the corner of the room where she sat. Ms. Landry was talking about final projects, something about themes and character development. Grace was listening, sort of, but her thoughts drifted. A week ago, she couldn't even look anyone in the eye. Now, she wasn't just raising her hand in class. She was thinking about signing up to read her final essay out loud. It still scared her, but not as much as it used to. The bell rang. Students shot up, grabbing their bags, joking about the weekend. "Don't forget," Ms. Landry said, raising her voice slightly. "Projects are due next Friday. No late submissions." Grace slipped her notebook into her backpack, moving a little slower than the rest. Jasmine brushed past her on the way out, not saying anything. Claire followed, but didn't even look her way. It didn't sting like it used to. Grace wasn't looking for their approval anymore. She stood and turned to leave when Ms. Landry called her name. "Grace?" She stopped. "Yeah?" Ms. Landry smiled. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You've been showing a lot of courage lately." Grace felt her face warm. "Thanks. I'm trying." "Well, it shows." Grace nodded once, then left the room. The hallway was calmer now. A few students lingered at their lockers, but most had already left. She headed toward the back stairwell, where it was always quiet. That's where she found him. Mr. Jenkins. He was sitting on the bottom step, holding a half-empty bottle of water. His mop and bucket were parked nearby. Grace approached slowly. "You hiding from someone?" He looked up with a grin. "Nope. Just taking a break. I earned it." She sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "What's that?" he asked. "My final essay," she said. "Want to hear it?" Mr. Jenkins sat up a little straighter. "I'd be honored." She unfolded the paper, smoothing it out with her palm. Her voice was steady, but quiet. "It's about how sometimes the people who sit on the edges of the room are the ones paying the most attention. How we assume silence means weakness. But sometimes it just means someone hasn't been heard yet." Mr. Jenkins listened closely, his eyes fixed on her face. Grace continued, "It's about how someone can make a difference without saying much, just by showing up, sitting beside you, letting you feel like you're not invisible." She glanced at him, then back at the paper. "It's about a girl who thought she had to fix everything herself until someone reminded her she didn't have to." She paused at the end. "That's it," she said. Mr. Jenkins was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "That's one of the best essays I've ever heard," he said. Grace smiled. "You're just saying that because it's about you." He chuckled. "Maybe, but I've heard a lot of stories in my life, and this one, it matters." She folded the paper again and tucked it back into her bag. "You think people can really change?" she asked. "I think people are changing all the time," he said. "Most just don't notice until they look back." She thought about that. "I guess I'm not the same girl who cried at her desk last week." "No," he said. "You're not." Grace stood up. Her backpack felt lighter somehow. "I'm gonna go," she said. "I think I'll walk home today." He nodded. "I'll be around." "I know." She turned and started down the hallway. The sunlight followed her through the doors, and as she stepped outside, the world didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Not because everything was fixed, but because someone had seen her and stayed. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.